All right, here we are for another biology video. As you can see, this one's entitled Meiosis and Variation. And variation should be something that strikes you as something we've been talking about a lot recently. Um, and we're about to talk about evolution, and evolution won't happen without reproduction. So we're going to start with that. And then we'll see that variation is very important. But first, there's two types of reproduction. There's asexual and sexual reproduction, and we have to make sure that we know the difference between these and the scientific definition of those. Because when humans think about sex, you just think about human sex, like intercourse. But there's other things, other ways to reproduce. And if we were in class right now, actually, we would be doing all kinds of activities about some of the interesting ways that other organisms reproduce. But they can be lumped into these two categories. Asexual means that you're going to make a clone from one existing organism. Now, a lot of times these are going to be single-celled organisms, so it says from one existing cell. And that would be something called binary fission. This is how bacteria reproduce. And they basically just split into two. They make a copy of their nucleus and then just pull apart. And you had one, and now you have two. Some bacteria can do that as quickly as every 20 minutes. They're really good at this. But it only works if you have one single cell and you have only one chromosome, which is what those cells have. Some larger animals, and by larger I mean they're still microscopic, are shown here. You can straight up cut these guys in half and you'll get another offspring from that one. And the starfish, you might know that you can take apart a starfish and you'll get the arms will grow back into a whole starfish, and the other starfish will grow its arm back. Some species, like this one, reproduce by something called budding, where this little version of the adult just kind of shows up right there, right? Like imagine you had this a little human that started to grow out of your side, and then when it was big enough to be a fully baby, it would just plop off of you and the baby would just fall down, right? That would be weird. But the important thing here is that all of these versions are clones. This little guy is genetically exactly the same as that one. Of course, these guys are all going to be genetically the same because they all started from the same organism, right? And so it's a very fast and sometimes useful strategy, right? If you're the last of your species, you could just plop off another one of you, and now you're not the last of your species, and that would be nice if you were, say, an endangered species. But most of these won't be endangered because they can just reproduce so quickly. But there is a downfall to this. As they're reproducing, they're always staying the same, and there will be mutations. But let's not think about mutations for a minute here. Barring any major mutations, all of the offspring will be exactly the same. And then if some sort of environmental change happens, a virus comes through that affects only red cells, well, guess what? You're all red cells and you're all exactly the same. And so if you have a weakness to this new virus, then everybody has a weakness to that virus and you can all be wiped out. Again, maybe there'll be mutations in there that might save a few, but for the most part, this is everybody has the same strengths, but also has the same weaknesses. But in sexual reproduction, you have a combination of genetic material. Two different cells have to combine to make this thing called a zygote, which is a fancy word for a fertilized egg, right? And so this is going to create new combinations of genes, and the offspring won't be clones. And so the way that this happens is something called meiosis, which is what part of this video is going to be about. But just to show the model again, here we have two cells that are from two parents that are diploid. That's what the two, and if maybe you remember that we talked about that, everybody has two of every chromosome. So you take these two cells, but you split them into what are called gametes, your eggs and your sperm cells, right? Then you can take these gametes and combine them. Now, the combinations lead to new variations. Right off the bat, you saw two red ones that just combined, and maybe you think that would be weird. That'd be two gametes from the same organism, and obviously that would be bad if you were a human. But there are actually a lot of organisms where that is possible. A lot of them are plants, but some species can self-fertilize if given the chance. And so if you combine them, you can get your good old red and blue cells. But then the big part is that you can combine the red cells with the blue cells, right? The red parent and the blue parent can mate to make a red-blue, and then you can maybe get a blue-red, right? And then when the red cell virus comes through, sure, the red cells are going to go away. And maybe, I don't know what's up with that guy. It's got a red outside and a blue inside. Maybe this one is like slightly hurt, but not completely dead. But the other ones are not hurt and they're not dead because there's variation. Then something interesting that will happen is that even when you start to combine your gametes, when this guy goes off to make their gametes, of course, you can sometimes give red and sometimes give blue, like you kind of remember from genetics, right? If you have a red one and a blue one, you have to give one of them. But the chromosomes can actually mix together. We'll talk about how that will work. And so then you'll get something totally new. You'll get some purple in there or some pink in there. And of course, obviously, the colors are just symbols and metaphors. But the idea is that variation comes from sexual reproduction. And so we don't want our offspring to be clones. And of course, we started with this idea of the two parents who have these children that are very different. And so that can only happen thanks to variations. And just to remind us that the variations come from the random way that the chromosomes are given. I don't know which one of these are going to go into each sperm or egg cell. One of them has to go. Maybe it's the one on the left. Maybe it's the one on the right. Depends on how it all works. And so what we want to know is, how does that work? It happens through this thing called meiosis. And if this was a normal year, maybe I would be a little bit more stickler about what's about to happen and that you have to memorize everything. But right now, it's important to see that there is a mechanical process that is going to make our gametes and produce all this variation. The variation is a natural consequence of the events that are about to happen. So we're going to start with an individual who has 6 chromosomes, 3 pairs of homologous chromosomes, right? Everybody has 2, one from father, one from mother. And then we do have to make a copy of these things. And this is a part that we kind of have not talked about too much, but before you can make new cells, you have to make a copy of your DNA, or else you'll just lose DNA, right? Like, and this kind of came up a few times. Students asked me, like, well, if I give half my DNA, like, I only have half left. Well, that's not true. You make extras and then you give them away, and so you don't actually lose DNA. So we start with this cell, and these would have been in a nucleus, but the nucleus is kind of gone now, and we just have these chromosomes that are just kind of floating around. The first thing that we need to do is get the homologous chromosomes separated from each other. So the blue and red ones are going to find their pair, right? The one that came from dad and the one that came from mom are going to find each other. This is then going to allow them to line up as a pair. And so when they line up this way, there's like this imaginary line that goes basically right there. And in the next step, these two parts are going to be pulled to the side, right? And so just by this mechanism of lining up and pulling to the sides, we have now separated the blue from the red. The father chromosomes are separated from the mother chromosomes, right? You can't give both to your kid. If you remember, right? If you're big A, little a, and this is the big A, there's also a big A, and here's the little a, you can't give the big A and the little a to your offspring. So you split them up. And that happened just by them pairing up and then lining up. It's a very simple mechanism that leads to a very important outcome. Now, we still have the copies that are stuck to each other, so we still need to get those apart. And actually, it's going to be pretty much a repeat of the last time. There's no pairs anymore, so there's no pairing up. They're just going to skip right to the lining up part. And there's an imaginary line that goes down the middle. That's not a very straight imaginary line, but there's that imaginary line, and then you pull to the sides, and now the copies have been separated, and we've successfully made 4 gametes. We started with one cell that was diploid. It had mother and father sets of chromosomes, and then we split them twice, actually, to make these gametes that have half as many. And again, this is something that's pretty important, that you can't reproduce with your double cells, because then if you combine 2 of the 2 ends, plus 2n makes 4n, and that would be bad. But n plus n equals 2n, which is what we wanted to start with, right? And so we need to do this process just to make our eggs and sperm. And in that process, there's variation. These are different from these, right? The blue ones are different from the red ones. If you use the blue ones to make a baby, you will get a different baby than if you use the red ones. So keep that in mind, that in the way that I made this happen, all the blue ones ended up on one side of the line and all the red ones ended up on another side of the line, right? Just to reemphasize that, right? All the blue ones are on the left and all the red ones are on the right, but didn't have to do it that way. And so one of the major sources of variation is this thing called independent assortment. It's just a fancy way of saying the chromosomes can line up differently. So before, again, like I had them with the all blues on the left and all the reds on the right, now they've lined up differently. And so now we have blue, red, blue, and red, blue, red. And those are two different combinations, right? And so we already had two combinations, all blue and all red. Now we have these two combinations. So now there's been 4 combinations. But they didn't have to line up that way either. They could have lined up like this, which makes 2 more combinations for a total of 6. But they also could have lined up like this, which makes 2 other combinations for a total of 8 combinations, right? So just by the random way that the chromosomes line up, it makes this variation. Now here's another version to show you a diagram that has 2 pairs of homologous chromosomes. And again, the idea would be that if you line up with the blue and the yellow on one side, you'll get blue and yellow cells, right? But then that's not quite the same as the yellow-blue, right? So those are a little bit different. So there's 2 combinations that they can make here. But then also on the bottom, the 2 blues could have been on one side to make all blue, and then the yellows would be on the other side to make all yellow. So there's 4 combinations that you can make using 2 chromosomes. And there's actually some math with this. There's 2 places you could be, left or right, and you can do this 3 times, and 2 to the 3rd power is 8, which is how many we knew. 2 combinations, or 2 places you could be, left or right, and this time there was 2, and 2 squared is 4, right? And so you have 4 combinations here and 8 combinations over there, but you have 2 possibles, left and right, and 23 pairs of chromosomes. 2 to the 23rd power is 8,388,608. There are 8 million different eggs and sperm that each human can make. Every one of those different combinations will be slightly different than all the others, right? That is a lot of combinations. That is a ton of variation, right? Just from one single individual, right? And so because of independent assortment, we could have a whole number of different chromosomes. Oops, I thought there was going to be more, right? That you could make just by the way they line up. Then, somewhere in this process, early on, when the chromosomes pair up with each other, they actually can swap parts of their DNA, as being shown on this diagram, right? So this is an interesting idea, right? If you were, say, like this is the chromosome that came from dad. If you were to use this chromosome to give to your offspring, you would literally just be passing the same chromosome that came from your father onto your kid, right? Like it would be like a baton race. And your kid would end up with a lot of traits that was just like your grandfather, assuming they were dominant, right? Like it depends on the combinations. And the same over here, if you use that one, it would be all grandma. But these 2 middle ones, they got real close during pairing up. And right at the spot where they intersect, they would trade corresponding segments, right? Like imagine you were sitting in class and your foot like went a little bit too far into the aisle when there were aisles in classes, and your foot accidentally like hit the person next to you's foot, right? Like, and that's all awkward. Like, oh, I'm sorry, my foot touched your foot. But if this was DNA, your foot would break off of your leg and go onto their leg, and their foot would break off of their leg and go onto your leg, and you would swap feet, right? Obviously, it doesn't happen, but these are chromosomes, and it does happen. And so in this chromosome, you have mostly grandfather chromosomes or genes, but a little bit of grandma. And then this one's mostly grandma and a little bit of grandpa, right? If you use one of these chromosomes to make your offspring, you are now, in effect, taking your parents and mixing them together and then giving them to your kid. And so this is going to come up with chromosomes that have never existed before, right? Like the combination of those genes isn't from a single person. It's from two different people, right? And so this is going to make even more variation. And then lastly, I want to point out that this could happen multiple times, right? This is a more simple way to look at it, but crossing over could happen all over the place. And this is really, really, really going to shuffle up the genes and make a lot of different offsprings. And that happened during this part, during the pairing up, and I forgot that was going to be there. So finally, all of what we talked about so far is only for one individual. You can make 8 million different sperms or eggs, plus those 8 million have all this crossing over things happening in them, but you need 2 people for sexual reproduction. So you don't know which sperm is going to meet with the egg. There are 8 million possible sperms and 8 million possible eggs that could be there to meet up with, which means that there are 64 trillion combinations of chromosomes that each of the children could have, right? This is just between 2 humans, right? 2 parents could make 64 trillion different kids. Obviously, there's not enough time to do that. But another way to think of it would be that if your parents were to have another child, there is a 1 out of 64 trillion chance that that kid will be exactly like you, which is obviously not really going to happen. Theoretically could happen. But honestly, theoretically couldn't happen, because when you have the crossing over, some of those 64 trillion combinations, even if you were to get the same exact independent assortment, some of them would have already been mixed together with father and mother chromosomes, and therefore it would be totally different, right? So you don't know me that well, but maybe by this time you have realized that I'm not all that much into like the whole like, oh, you're all a unique and special snowflake kind of touchy-feely like teacher. But you are extremely unique, and so is everybody else. And this leads to a whole lot of variations, all kinds of differences between humans. And that's just within the human species, right? Like, of course, there's variation across all the different species as well. This is extremely important for evolution. So just to recap one time, mutations are a thing. I haven't talked about mutations out during the video, but every time you do this, every time you make your eggs and sperm, or this thing called mitosis, which is where you just grow, there will be mutations. You can't stop them. Basically, most eggs or sperm end up with approximately 60 mutations in them. Most of them are harmless, as you might remember, but they are there. And so the children, even for asexual reproducing species, the babies won't always be exactly the same. A lot of them will be exactly the same, but some of them will have mutations. But then you have crossing over, which combines and recombines the chromosomes to make totally new combinations. And then once you recombine them, then you shuffle them up with independent assortment and you give out one or the other, and you end up with those 8 million possibilities, right? So lots of sources of variation, and all of it comes from just this mechanism of pairing up, crossing over, lining up in a random way, and then splitting them in half. And then you give that half to your kid, and then that's reproduction. And when this happens on a whole species level, a whole population level, then you get tons and tons and tons of variation, as you see in humans, right? And then that variation can be acted upon by evolution, which we will be talking about as we go forward.